They say her name was Miriam, though the empire preferred its women nameless. She was young, quiet, the kind of figure who drifted through the bazaar with her shawl drawn close, letting the world mistake silence for obedience. And yet tonight, as the fortress gates rattled and the Anatolian wind, her story would become an official warning. What happened to her would be repeated in whispers for years, though the details were always softened, trimmed, or swallowed. The only thing everyone remembered clearly was the sound that clung to her in every retelling, the faint scratch of coarse cloth moving against her skin as she trembled. That sound, small as it was, outlived the spectacle itself. The cold open of her final night begins not with violence, but with accusation, the most efficient weapon the Empire ever forged. A rumor crossed a soldier's tongue, a neighbor repeated it, a clerk stamped it, and suddenly Miriam, who could barely read, was called a spy for rebels she had never met. In the Ottoman courts of security, innocence was irrelevant. What mattered was the message a body could send. Her body specifically. The state believed women made the best examples because they inspired the deepest fear. If even the harmless could be punished, then everyone else could be controlled. As Miriam was taken from her home, she clutched the fabric of her dress just to hear that quiet scratch. It steadied her, kept her present. She didn't plead, she didn't curse. She simply listened to that threadbare rasp beneath her hands. Even the guards noticed how she focused on it, as though trying to anchor her sanity to something too ordinary to be taken away. Viewers of this channel, you know the pattern by now. A woman accused, a government threatened, a punishment designed not for justice, but for theater. And if you're new here, if you just stumbled into the Crimson Archive, then stay. Because tonight's expose is not about gore, not about spectacle, not about feeding the algorithms of shock. It's about the psychology of power, the way an empire crafted fear, and the long hidden stories of the women who stood beneath that machinery. Subscribe now so you don't miss what comes after this, because the truth we're stepping into is one that history tried very hard to suffocate. Miriam was brought to the citadel at dusk, not dragged, not beaten. The Ottomans understood that silence could be a cruelty of its own. The less force they used, the more those watching filled in the blanks with imagination. And imagination historically has always been a far more obedient servant of terror than any soldier's blade. She was placed before the city gate, the place where messages were carved into public memory. The crowd gathered in waves, murmuring, staring, already convinced that she must have done something terrible to deserve this. Empires never needed proof, only an audience. The executioners didn't raise their voices, they didn't threaten. They explained the sentence with the casual tone of bureaucrat reading weather reports. But each time Miriam shifted, the scratch of her dress echoed in her ears. That fragile reminder that she was still human in a space built to deny humanity. She looked up at the walls, at the hooks glinting in the dying sun. And though we won't describe what those instruments were meant to do, know this. Their purpose was to suspend a body between earth and sky, to turn suffering into skyline. What mattered was not the physical process, what mattered was the message. The Ottomans believed fear worked best when it was elevated, visible from every street and prayer house. They believed women were the perfect medium for this lesson, because when a woman appeared on those walls, the message wasn't just political, it was personal, domestic, intimate. Every mother, sister, daughter who walked beneath those gates understood instantly what was being threatened. And as Miriam stood before the crowd, listening to the scratch of her own worn cloth, she grasped that truth with devastating clarity. The empire didn't need her guilt, it needed her presence. Her final breath of freedom came with a single thought, not of rebellion, not of fear, but of bewildered disbelief. Because how could a state this vast, this educated, this proud depend so completely on breaking women to maintain its throne? They called it a mechanism, as if reducing cruelty to engineering could wash the blood from its logic. But the Ottomans, like many empires of their age, understood that the real machinery wasn't metal, it was obedience. And so the device at the center of Miriam's fate was less a tool of bodily torment and more a symbol, a curved shadow forged to reshape the minds of everyone who saw it. What mattered was not its iron, not its weight, not its construction. What mattered was how it looked dangling from the fortress gates, how it suggested what could be done to a person without ever needing to show the details. When the executioners prepared the apparatus, they made no attempt to hide it. That was the point. A hidden punishment only disciplines the prisoner. A visible one disciplines the city. Miriam stood there, her wrists bound, listening once again to the scratch of her rough dress, steady, rhythmic, the single tether that kept her breathing evenly. She understood now. The entire event was orchestrated like a public sermon, the officers murmuring to each other, the clerks noting her name in the ledger, the crowd shifting uncomfortably, waiting for something they fear yet cannot look away from. The Empire did not need to convince people the device was agonizing. It needed only to convince them that anyone could be brought before it. This was the core principle behind the punishment: visibility as domination. The state believed rebels hid among ordinary citizens, so the state turned ordinary citizens into theaters of intimidation. Women like Miriam, who held no weapons, who lived uneventful lives, were singled out precisely because their ordinariness made them perfect rhetorical tools. If she could be named a traitor, then anyone could. If she could be displayed at the gates, then no household was safe. And if no household was safe, then no rebellion could ever gather momentum. It is here in the dry administrative cruelty of these decisions that the true horror lies, not in flesh, not in hooks, but in the calculated psychology of governance. A scribe stepped forward and read the accusation aloud, his voice trembling not from pity but from the pressure of performing loyalty. He described her supposed contact with rebels, her alleged concealment of messages, her invented espionage. None of it was supported by evidence. Most of it was assembled from hearsay. But in a system where the Empire's security corps held absolute authority, evidence was a luxury reserved for men of higher rank. For women, the accusation itself was the verdict. Miriam's breath quickened. The scratch of her cloth grew louder in her awareness, as if each fiber were screaming on her behalf, vibrating with a helpless rhythm. She tried to focus on that sound. It was the last thing in her world she could control. The mechanism loomed behind the scribe like a silent punctuation mark, a comma in the story of empire, waiting to turn her life into a warning. She was made to stand beneath it as the officer explained in chillingly routine language that her punishment was meant to secure loyalty in districts prone to sedition. That phrase, repeated across dozens of villages and fortresses, stripped the humanity from countless women long before any sentence was carried out. Behind the ceremony, the political motive pulsed beneath everything. The Ottoman administration was terrified of internal fractures, terrified of local uprisings, terrified of women acting as messengers for rebels. A possibility greatly exaggerated, often invented entirely, but useful for justifying harsh displays of control. Empires rarely admit fear, but their punishments always reveal it. And so the spectacle served a dual purpose. To the population, it said, loyalty is survival. But to the officials themselves, it whispered a darker reassurance. If you make the people afraid, you never need to fear them. As the guards moved to position Miriam, the crowd fell silent. Not out of respect, but out of recognition. This wasn't justice. This was politics disguised as righteousness. Even those who believed the accusations felt unease crawl beneath their skin. Because they too heard it now. The quiet, persistent scratch of her worn dress. The small human sound swallowed by an empire trying desperately to make her less than human. And yet the sound survived. It always survives.
History records outcomes. It rarely records consequences. The ripple effects that move through villages, families, generations. And in the case of Miriam, the Empire's example did not land the way its officials expected. Her sentence, however theatrically staged, produced not submission, but fracture. A quiet internal rupture within the very communities the Ottomans hoped to intimidate. The moment the officers finished their ritualized announcements, something shifted in the crowd. People inhaled sharply. Women clutched their shawls. Men looked at the ground, pretending not to watch. And yet every single one of them heard the same thing. The scratch of Miriam's dress trembling against her body as the guards lifted her toward the great gate. That sound, thin, threadbare, defiant, would haunt the city far longer than the punishment itself. The Ottomans never anticipated that a sound so ordinary could become an act of resistance. The aftermath began immediately. The crowd dispersed not with the discipline the empire expected, but with a kind of stunned shame. Mothers hurried home and barred their doors. Husbands whispered to their wives to stay indoors, as if the accusation of treachery might spread like a draft through the streets. The city's gossip mills, normally filled with petty rivalries, churned now with a single question. If this could happen to her, then who among us is safe? This question was dangerous, more dangerous than any rebel blade. Fear, when too concentrated, becomes contempt, and contempt, when directed upward, becomes rebellion. In the weeks after Miriam's punishment, local administrators noticed subtle shifts. Women stopped appearing at the bazaars except at dawn. Midwives refused to enter military barracks. The local guild of weavers, almost entirely female, delivered their goods late, claiming illness or weather or broken looms. Nothing overt, nothing that could be punished, just a slow, deliberate tightening of silence around the state's authority. Empires often misunderstand silence. They think it signals obedience. In truth, it is one of the first signs of resistance. But the true shock, the unpredictable moment that rewrote the narrative, came from a source the Ottomans believed firmly under their control: the fortress guards themselves. 3 nights after the execution, the captain of the night watch reported something unsettling. Not rebellion, not sabotage, something stranger. The guards stationed along the wall began hearing a faint, repetitive noise near the gate. A soft rasping, a friction of fabric, a whispering sweep in the wind, like a dress brushing stone. They dismissed it at first: wind, birds, imagination. But it grew louder each night, always at the same hour. The higher officers insisted it was nothing, the echo of a traumatized city projected onto its own architecture. But the regular soldiers, the ones who stood in the cold hour after midnight, began refusing gate duty. They muttered about unfinished business, about injustice lingering in the stones. They claimed the sound followed them home beneath their windows, across the threshold of their dreams. Always that same rhythm: scratch, 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 as if a tattered hem trailed behind them. Superstition spread faster than any official decree. Villagers in outlying districts started tying strips of cloth to their doors to keep the spirits of the wronged at rest. Women began wearing thicker shawls, believing the extra fabric might protect them from accusations of treachery. And, most telling of all, local rebels, long inactive, suddenly found their ranks swelling. Not with warriors, with informants, with bread makers, with women carrying coded messages in the seams of their garments. A punishment meant to crush dissent had instead sown the seeds of coordination. But the empire didn't realize this yet. Its officials, sealed inside their stone offices, believed the silence that followed Miriam's death was victory. They wrote reports praising the deterrent effect. They congratulated each other on quelling unrest. They never walked the streets at night. They never heard the scratch of cloth following them in the empty alleyways. They never saw the way women looked at each other, not afraid anymore, but aware. Because here lies the true shock. Miriam's execution didn't scare women into silence. It united them. The scratch of her dress became a symbol whispered across provinces, a reminder that the state could destroy a body, but not a lesson, not a memory, not a movement. And in the decades that followed, officials would cite this region again and again as a persistent center of female agitation. They never understood why, but every woman in those villages remembered the same thing: the sound that refused to die.
Years later, the empire would pretend none of it happened. Reports were burned, ledgers rewritten, officials reassigned. Miriam's name, if it ever existed in their files, vanished into the dust of imperial archives. And yet the one thing the Ottomans could never erase was the noise that lingered in memory: the scratch of her rough dress, the unintentional anthem of every woman who refused to let fear dictate her silence. That sound traveled farther than any imperial decree. It spread through stories told at night, through coded lullabies sung to children, through the quiet resolve that passed from mother to daughter. No one celebrated Miriam as a rebel. She never asked to be one. Her legacy was not built on ideology or uprising. It was built on the uncomfortable truth that empires collapse not from the strength of their enemies, but from the cruelty they believe no one will remember. Modern historians sometimes dismiss these accounts. They look for documentation, signatures, seals, maps, anything that fits neatly into a footnote. But history has always been bigger than ink. It lives in the fears people inherit and the courage they discover in spite of those fears. And in the regions where Miriam's story was whispered, a strange pattern formed. Girls born generations after her grew up wary of authority, yet fearless with each other. They learned to speak carefully in public, but boldly in private. They trusted cloth more than courts, sewing secrets into hems, stitching warnings into seams. Even today, in some old Anatolian villages, elders swear the wind makes a particular sound near abandoned fortresses. Not a howl, not a whistle, a friction, a brushing, a soft, persistent scratch. And no one dares ignore it. Because that sound carries a lesson, one that stretches from Ottoman gates to modern borders. The lesson that power built on fear must constantly reinvent cruelty to sustain itself. The lesson that governments, even now, still disguise control as protection. The lesson that women, especially women accused of disloyalty, have always been made into symbols before they are ever treated as people. We like to think we are past this, past the era of public punishments, past the age of silencing through spectacle. But listen closely, and you'll hear the echoes, not in hooks or gates, but in headlines, in trials rushed for convenience, in entire communities marked as suspect before evidence is even considered. The methods change, the message rarely does. And you, watching this, might feel that same uneasy pull Miriam felt, the sense that something ordinary is being reshaped into something sinister. You might catch yourself wondering how many quiet injustices go unnoticed because they lack the theatricality of the past. How many people are disbelieved simply because their stories don't fit into the structure of acceptable suffering? How many governments still depend implicitly or explicitly on the fear of what could happen to someone who steps out of line? So here, in our final moments together, I want you to sit with one question. When a society uses fear to enforce order, is the true danger disobedience or obedience itself? Let that settle for a moment. Let it slow your thoughts. Let it unsettle your certainty. Because history is not a museum of cruelty. It is a mirror. And every atrocity we expose in the Crimson Archive reflects a choice humanity continues to make. Miriam never asked to be a symbol. She never asked to be remembered. But symbols choose themselves. They choose the moment fear becomes unbearable. They choose the instant an empire mistakes silence for victory. And in the long shadow of that mistake, her story still moves, quiet, steady, unforgettable, like the scratch of cloth in the dark. If this expose stirred something in you, stay with us. Subscribe so you don't miss the next descent into the hidden corridors of history, where truth waits in the places empires hoped you would never look. And listen closely. The past still speaks. The question is whether we're brave enough to hear it.